Hi, everybody. Good morning. Thank you for the invitation. I work at Eastern State Penitentiary, prison museum up near the Art Museum. It wasn't always near the Art Museum. It was built on farmland outside of Philadelphia, built with the belief that people are inherently good, and if kept in solitary confinement, they would look in their hearts and they would become penitent. It's the world's first true penitentiary, a building designed to enforce remorse. Didn't work that well, as you might guess, from our society that is not free of crime, but that was the original idea behind the building. It drove that decision, as Seth would say, to try to use solitary confinement to reform people, led them to build this star-shaped floor plan that was copied all over the world. There are about 300 copies of Eastern State Penitentiary on 5 continents, particularly in Europe, but you also find them in Asia. Here we are in Mexico City. Here we are in London. They're still building these prisons. Here's one, a modern prison in the UK. And if you play the game Sim City and you tell the computer you want to put a prison in your simulated city, here's what it gives you. The architecture of the building has always been a lot easier to talk about than the people. There are about 85,000 men and women incarcerated in that building over the course of 142 consecutive years. And each one of them leaves a whole legacy of records. And of course, they're all gone. There's not a single person left in the building. The building survived well past that original idea. They gave up that solitary confinement system in the 20th century. It was a congregate system, as we call it in prisons, where the people living there could, this is the maintenance crew trying to maintain a 100-year-old prison, guards at the front door. Finally, in 1970, the state left. Here are the last guys being transferred out with a surprisingly jaunty wave, actually, as they closed the prison and left us this artifact that is beautiful and romantic, capital R romantic, and lies to us. It feels so peaceful. It's so photogenic. It's designed to have this sort of church-like appearance, and it still does. By the mid-1980s, the city had purchased the property. By the mid-1980s, it looked like this. And the city began looking for ways to turn over the property for other uses, like a shopping mall or perhaps condominiums. To its credit, the city eventually decided that the building deserved better than to be turned into a banana republic. And so the city turned the building back over to a team of historians and preservationists and criminologists. And they had, now I've got this idea of choices in my head from Seth's comments. They had a choice. They could either raise $25 million and open a big sophisticated museum, or they could go the other direction and simply open it, hand out hard hats, and just, because the building was clearly dangerous, and just open the building and trust the building to be interesting on its own. And they, of course, chose that second choice. They just opened the building. And that DNA has been with us ever since. It's part of our organizational gestalt, is that we trust the building to be interesting, we trust it to help us tell stories, and we try as much as possible to keep out of the way. So we, in the beginning, literally, this is actually me giving tours in the 90s to kids in hard hats. We've long ago stabilized the building enough that we no longer need hard hats, but it is still a ruinous building. Most visitors take an audio tour narrated by Steve Buscemi. We give about 35,000 guided tours a year. From the very earliest years, we've worked with artists, and I understand that there's a lot of interest in this group in perhaps working with artists. I thought I would tell you about some of the artist installations we've had over the years. A Philadelphia artist recognized that Oscar Wilde was sentenced to Reading Jail, actually, in 1895, essentially for refusing to deny that he was gay, something that to a modern visitor is, of course, morally repugnant, but was a use of our building, or use of a building modeled after Eastern State. And so, that's Reading Jail, by the way, the prison that Oscar Wilde was held in. And to say the two buildings look alike, Reading is one of those jails modeled, one of those prisons modeled after Eastern State. That's Eastern on the left, Reading on the right. And so he put these silk lilies in the hallways, and Virgil's a textile artist. And Oscar Wilde had this lifelong fascination with wallpaper. Anybody know what Oscar Wilde's last words were supposed to be? he was dying in a hotel in France, and apparently his last words were, "Either this wallpaper goes or I do." So Virgil made wallpaper for Oscar Wilde to take a cell that Wilde would have recognized, almost the exact dimensions of the cell that Oscar Wilde was living in Reading, and made a more appropriate cell for one of our great poets and playwrights. The chair rails quotes from Oscar Wilde about sin and wickedness. Wickedness is a myth invented by good people to account for the curious attractiveness of others. This is Nick Cassaway's piece called Portraits of Inmates in the Death Row Population Sentenced as Juveniles. He stenciled the faces of people awaiting execution for crimes they committed as children onto plate steel. And then over time, as those plates rusted, they became, the whole image, of course, began to change. And then as those people were executed, he'd seal the entire plate with a clear rust inhibitor to seal it off so it would stop changing. The only reason we took this piece off of view was because the Supreme Court, he made the piece knowing that the Supreme Court was going to rule on the constitutionality of this practice. And after the case was over, they incidentally ruled it unconstitutional. There was no point in having this commentary on a policy that no longer existed. It's Elon Sandler's piece called A Rest. Elon's sister Simone was murdered in 1995. She was strangled in Toronto. Elon worked in cell block 10, one of our cell blocks that has no doors. The doors were sold, we think, for scrap metal. He interviewed his parents about what it was like to lose a child to murder. The speakers in the back of the cell are playing his parents' heartbeats. He recorded their heartbeats as he asked them a series of very painful questions, and then he made doors, essentially resealing. I missed an important part of the story. The person who murdered Simone has never been identified, presumably is still free. He sealed off these doors. He kind of closed off these cells with words from his parents in that conversation. This one says, "I'd like to know the person who did this is dead." This one says, "I want to tell people who did not know Simone about her strength and her goodness. We want to know why she was singled out. Was she just in the wrong place at the wrong time?" This is a piece by Michelle Handelman that's on view right now about the experiences of trans people in our prisons today. There are monologues that she wrote based on real stories, and then she had actors perform them, and then she projects them at life size at the back of a cell. It was very eerie. William Cromar's piece called Gitmo. It's a recreation of a Guantanamo Bay cell inside of an Eastern State Penitentiary cell, accurate right down to the arrow pointing to Mecca to allow for Islamic worship, Muslim worship. And this is Jesse Crimes's piece. Jesse made this piece while he was incarcerated in federal prison. He transferred images from the New York Times using hair gel onto bed sheets, which he was not supposed to be doing, but then he mailed those bed sheets home to himself in 37 packages, keeping an elaborate chart of what it would look like when it was all reassembled. But he never saw it reassembled until he got home. And here it is installed in cell block 8 of Eastern State Penitentiary. It's really exquisite. And a brand new piece that just opened a couple weeks ago. This is Rachel Dahlon's piece called Doris Jean. Rachel focuses on a man named Milton Schwartz, who was incarcerated at Eastern State in the 1950s because he and his wife tried to provide an abortion to a young, very prominent socialite in Philadelphia in 1955 when abortion was illegal, and she died in that procedure. Milton was a bartender. Of course, medical doctors weren't allowed to perform these procedures. Milton wound up as an Eastern State prisoner at the end of this story. She's taken what Seth would call primary source documents. She's taken these newspaper articles and reproduced them right into the windows of our greenhouse. It's really beautiful, and the more you read, the more upsetting it becomes. Artists have in many ways led us in showing how we could engage our audiences in talking about complicated aspects of American policy today. We have a long history, and if I had more time, I would chronicle all the failed attempts that we had of creating experiences for our visitors that encourage reflection on the American criminal justice system today. We really struggled for a long, long time. I also believed for a long time personally that our audience didn't want to talk about policy beyond a certain point. I thought that we should use metaphor, that we could talk very broadly, but really specific things about American criminal justice policy today would bore our visitors, particularly statistics. And I made this argument for probably 15 years before finally sitting down and talking to some visitors, which turns out they're there every day. It's pretty easy just to say, hey, we got some glazed donuts, will you talk to us? So I spent a weekend in 2012 just talking to visitors, trying to get better at this work, and literally over the course of a weekend could not find a single person who thought that was inappropriate or sounded political. The big fear in this work, if you work at a museum, the big fear is that you're going to sound political, that your board is going to come at you for being political, that you're going to sound like you have an agenda. Honestly, I was partially doing this work to gather some ammunition to protect myself from that criticism. I could say, hey, trust me, our visitors don't find this political. Those criticisms never came, by the way. That was entirely something that lived in my own brain. We decided that if you only know 3 things about the criminal justice system today, you should know that there are more people in prison than there were in 1970 when Eastern State closed. Dramatically more people. We all knew there were more people, but way more people per capita in prison today than there were in 1970. That no other nation's doing this. We are alone in putting this percentage of people in prison. And that the racial disparity present in our prison population throughout the entire history of Eastern State Penitentiary is actually growing worse over time. Can you guess, of those 3 statistics, which was the one that made us nervous, which was the one that we were slowest to roll out? It was the race part. We were very nervous that talking about race in the criminal justice system would reinforce negative stereotypes. So I always find this a really awkward subject to talk about, but I also think it's really important to admit both how important that part, also how slowly we were to take this on, and we still struggle with this. But as a friend of mine once said, if this is not awkward, you're not doing it right. You know, if you're talking about race and the criminal justice system in 2018 and it isn't awkward, then you're doing something wrong. We started by just adding those 2 statistics. You notice the race part is missing, but those first 2 statistics to our main audio tour, so every single visitor would experience it. And from the beginning, we said, if this stuff works in 2 dimensions, we're museum people, and what's on that sign could be in a textbook. We said, you know, if this works, if this is subject matter that connects with people, it's on us to make it more of a museum-y experience, to make it more photogenic, to make it more interactive, to make it something that a group can discuss, multi-generational social experience. So we began looking at ways to express those statistics. These are grad students prototyping something that turned into our big graph. This is the rate of incarceration in US history between 1900 and 2010, and it shows you the rate of incarceration in 1970 and again the last full decade in 2010. Because the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, we can just list the rest of the nations below us. The height is the percentage of their population that they put in prison, and there's kind of no one in second place. We're way up there at the top. Number 2 is Rwanda, by the way. A lot of our visitors are not just surprised. Oh, and by the way, I should tell you also that we divide this left and right between countries that practice capital punishment and countries that don't. Because in the prototyping phase, so many of our visitors said, do some countries keep their prison populations low by just executing everybody? The answer is no. It would require, a true genocide to actually impact, a nation's prison population. But we got the question enough that we divide the list left and right. So there's the United States, the top on the left. We do practice capital punishment. We have the highest rate in the world. What really throws our visitors is that all of our allies, none of them practice capital punishment, and they're all down around belt buckle height. And that's where you see the cell phones come out. People saying, why are we so unlike the rest of our allies? And then finally, it was actually towards the end of the design process for the graph, and I was talking to some advisors. One of them's in the room. And we really decided that we had to talk about race on this graph, even though it's not perfect because the graph doesn't show you the US population, it only shows you the prison population. You don't see the difference between the racial breakdown of our prison population and the racial breakdown of the nation at large. You only see the racial breakdown of the prison population. That said, it's still troubling. There's the breakdown in 1970 and again the breakdown in 2010. The percentages haven't changed much, but it forces us to talk to every group who comes through about this. It's on the main audio tour, it's on the group tour route. If you bring a group of 4th graders to Eastern State, we will walk around the north side of that graph and say, Why are there so many people, why have there been so many people of color in our prison system, and why is that trend? We define it as a crisis, actually. I'll tell you more about that in a second, but it says, the signage actually says this, what should our nation do to address this crisis? Both defining it as a national problem and defining it as a crisis. But the communities most overrepresented in 1970 are the communities that have been most impacted by these changes in policy that have driven mass incarceration. And so the graph forces us to talk with every group about that because the thing is 16 feet tall and it's in the middle of the tour route. Somewhere along the line, we recognized that the United States has 2.2 million people in prison, the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and there is no place that Americans, there are plenty of university programs, there are policy and think tanks, but there's no museum that talks about criminal justice in any substantial way. And so we recognized if there was a national prison museum, we would be it, which was sort of a troubling sense of weight that there's kind of nowhere else out there doing this. We've begun adding information about contemporary prisons to everything we do. So it's just the standard, it's part of anything new that we're up to. So if we want to talk about the use of solitary confinement as a punishment, which they did in the 20th century, they built a hole where they put people as punishment. What about solitary confinement in prisons today? Put up a new sign about the kitchen. Well, what's prison food like in prisons today? Before we even finished that graph, we were already planning to build a companion exhibit that would try to talk about the impact on communities and the impact on actual families and individuals, because the story is more than just the statistics. That said, we find that with our audience, starting with statistics is actually a pretty good place to start. But we began working on an exhibit as a companion piece even before we finished the graph. And in doing that, we spent a lot of time looking at our audience. And this is not the approach that every museum would take, or that I'm not saying this is universally the way to go. But the choice that we made was to look at our audience that's already here. You know, we get 1,000 people a day come through that building in the summertime. And they are mostly white. Oh, sorry, I'm ahead of myself. They are mostly white, spoiler alert. They're young. They are mostly tourists. Actually, these are the 2015 numbers. I need to update this. There are over 80% now of our visitors are tourists to the city, and they're mostly white. About 80% white, about 80% tourists to the city. And what do you say to people who may not see themselves connected to the subject matter at all? You know, most museums ask questions. They do like what they call these intercept surveys. People are leaving. Oh, excuse me 1 second. I want to ask you one quick question. Did you like the exhibits? What was your favorite part? What was your least favorite part? And then you ask the more awkward questions towards the end. You say, how much money do you make? What race do you identify yourself? Where do you live? We've been doing that since the 90s. Getting ready for this exhibit, we started asking more questions, like, have you ever been arrested? Do you know anyone who's incarcerated? Do you work in law enforcement? Where'd you put yourself in the political spectrum between very liberal and very conservative? To try to get a sense of, and then the question we've come back to again and again, what is your connection to the criminal justice system? More than 70% of our visitors say none. They have no connection to the criminal justice system. They don't know someone in law enforcement. They don't know someone who's been incarcerated. They see themselves as completely disconnected. I would argue that they have much more connection to it than they think they do, but it's really helpful to know that walking in the door, 70% of our visitors think that this has nothing to do with them at all. All these policies are living in a different world. And that got us thinking about how the natural constituencies of people who are interested in criminal justice and people who aren't. So if you imagine an audience grouped in 5 people, let's say 100 people walk into Eastern State on a given hour, and then you divide them into groups of 20. There are some people who are going to be totally, completely indifferent, and you'll never reach them. Well, I've actually begun to waffle on this recently, thinking that maybe you're reaching them more than you realize. But while they're on your property, they're going to say things that are really frustrating. They're going to write comments in our comment book that are vaguely racist and occasionally explicitly racist. Those are the ones. And they're the 5s. They're people who are personally connected to the subject matter. They've been incarcerated. They have a loved one who's incarcerated. They work in criminal justice. They work in law enforcement. They work at a prison museum. I'm a 5. I try to remind myself that all the time. This is just sort of who I am as I walk down the street and get coffee. I'm still thinking about this stuff just because I have to. And then there are the fours. The fours are people just very well informed. So they might know a lot about criminal justice policy. They probably know a lot about economic policy too. You know these people. They're the fours. We came to think there isn't that much you can say to fours and fives in our environment. In a university environment, you could. In a policy environment, you could. But in our environment, people are in our building for about 2 hours. They're probably going to go into our exhibit for a little while, but there's really only so much you can say to a 4 or 5. They probably had nuanced thoughts about this last week, and they're probably going to have nuanced thoughts about it next week, and what they're doing today isn't going to have a huge impact. I used to say the ones were knuckleheads, and you have to ignore them. I've grown to think, and our frontline staff, our tour guides, really suffer with feeling complacent when people say really obnoxious things in our tours, and it does happen. I've grown to think that sometimes the ones may learn more from a visit to Eastern State or maybe more impacted than we realize, and maybe we've cracked the door a little bit to some broader, the word empathy is overused in museums right now, but just to complicate their thinking a little bit. The ones often are extraordinarily black and white, that, as I heard a visitor say once, if you can't handle society, you don't get to be in society. It's that simple. And his wife, I assume his wife, a middle-aged couple walking out of the building, she said, "It is not that simple, John. You know it's not." And I was like, they just had a good tour. Anyway, the ones tend to be very black and white, and so maybe they have more of an impact than we think. We really tried to build our programming for the 2s and 3s, the people who do not necessarily didn't get up this morning wanting to talk about criminal justice policy. They might leave the building and never know they've talked about criminal justice policy. I'll get to that again in a second. So when we built the exhibit, we prototyped with our existing audience. Our funder, by the way, the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage, let us get away with this. I was kind of surprised. I wrote in the grant proposal that paid for the exhibit, we're not trying to attract a new audience. It was an explicit question. What new audiences do you want to attract? And I wrote, we don't want to attract a new audience. We want to engage with our mostly white, mostly middle class, mostly suburban audience more substantially than we're currently engaging with them. And then I did write us. Secondarily, over time, we hope that this more complicated interaction with our visitors will begin to attract a different audience as well. But the primary goal was to get that audience to think more critically and more deeply about what's happening and the changes in our country. So we prototyped this thing to death. I always think that the most interesting prototypes are the ones that didn't work. Here we are with the question. You can see the question was originally, I think the criminal justice system works. And then, so we had to write in, for me, because people were saying, yeah, it works. It works to do a bunch of really obnoxious stuff that no one ever talks about. It works to suppress political representation. So we had to write for me. The question was, is this thing working for you? And then visitors they would self-identify by race and then put their little tags in. The point being that people's impression of the criminal justice system is highly predicted by race. It's extraordinarily predicted by race. And so we wanted to point out to our white visitors that if you think this system is working really well, that's a perspective that's probably that's highly predicted by your life experiences by race. It was too complicated to figure out a way to make this mechanism work for 1,000 people a day to come through. We couldn't figure out how it worked. Here's a variation though on the same subject, how do I fit? This is like, I've been incarcerated, I've worked in criminal justice, law enforcement, again by race. And again, we could never quite figure this out. But as we move forward, we began to find some of these prototypes that did work, like asking our visitors, have you ever broken the law? And we spent a lot of time, even that exact phrase, like what is the exact phrase that you use? This is our long-suffering intern, Julie, just with some painter's tape out in the hallways of the building, forcing visitors to walk on one side of the hallway or another, and then eavesdropping and seeing what kind of conversations followed. And so this did make it into the exhibit. So here it is in the concept drawings, and here it is the actual exhibit. When you walk into the body of the exhibit, you have to go left or right. And if you go to the right, we call this the liar's corridor, and we and we'll say we don't tell the visitors we call it that, but wow, that's really unusual. You've never broken the law, huh? A friend of mine says this is basically, pardon my language, this is basically calling bullshit on people, like, huh? But if you go to the left, you're faced with this artist installation by Troy Richards. Troy invites visitors to leave a confession of a time they broke the law. And you went to the left, so we know you've broken the law. But he mixes those confessions with confessions from people living in prison. If you push the buttons, you can figure out which is which, but as you first walk up, you have to guess. And the distinction, of course, museums manipulate their visitors. We claim we don't, but we actually do. And so we've curated this, obviously, a little bit, but we get some very, very disturbing confessions that are very specific and we believe they're true from our visitors from time to time. And so we mix them with confessions of people who have been, who are being punished for their crimes, and let visitors guess which is which. And you see all day long people gathered around this thing trying to guess. And I love it because it's both, it's funny and it's interesting and it's sort of fascinating, and then it's also really disturbing because it's really undermining our distinction of what criminal is. What is criminality the act of, is it the act or is it the conviction? And we always think of it as the conviction, but of course we know that there's all sorts of reasons that should not be the definition of criminality. Here's another one. We wanted to talk about privilege with our honestly quite privileged audience who doesn't see themselves as privileged. And so we wanted to turn it into a game and to try to say, like, what was your childhood like? We wanted to get something where people would talk to each other in the exhibit. And all ideas are stolen. This was inspired by an exhibit at the Exploratorium in San Francisco, where they had tables you could sit and face and do something together. So here we are prototyping this, and you can see at the time of this prototype, it actually says, check your privilege. And the big takeaway lesson here is, how do you talk to white people about white privilege? Step one, don't tell them you're going to talk about white privilege. It's kind of a non-starter. It's amazing, though, how you can just change. It's just like these triggers that, like, if you say privilege to some people, they immediately shut down. But if you say, hey, your childhood is highly predictive of rates of incarceration, they'll say, really? And you say, yeah, like, let's talk about your childhood for a second. So it turned into a game called Early Experiences Matter. And it's about your childhood. Here it is in some of the concept drawings, and it worked its way through and eventually became this game. You push the buttons saying what your household income was like, what the funding was like for your school district when you were a kid, whether you were exposed to real life trauma or violence. And as you push the buttons, it'll eventually tell you what people with childhoods like yours, what kind of rates of incarceration they're facing. The exhibit talks about private prisons. It talks about the effect on the electorate. Throughout this process, we were planning to try to go right down the middle and remain neutral, because museum people always believe that we have to be neutral. And so we say, well, on the one hand, but then on the other hand, and then you say, we didn't say anything. We just told you the way of the arguments either side. And I think in general, that's actually not a bad way to go, to inserting yourself into the conversation. In general, it's something that I think, for my line of work, a museum guy, should be careful about, do it with caution. That said, there are some things where it's really patronizing to tell your visitors that you believe there's an intellectual debate with any validity happening. And the mass incarceration policies of the 70s, 80s, and 90s have been a disaster, just an absolute disaster. And to say there's still a debate, there's, as far as I can tell, a single person in the United States who still believes that the war on drugs was a great idea. He happens to be the Attorney General. But aside from Jeff Sessions, people on the right sometimes are actually much more ambitious right now than people on the left, and saying, well, if this is, maybe it's because of the expense, maybe it's because of the impact on communities, maybe it's because of a belief in retribution or a belief in redemption. That evangelicals often now are saying that this whole system doesn't allow for people to change, and we should build that into our system. Anyway, we came to the conclusion that the debate was over, we can debate why those policies were passed, we can debate what we can do next, but to say that the war on drugs worked out great, there really isn't anyone out there saying that who we thought deserved space in the exhibit. And so we decided that the idea of being neutral was a cop-out. And it was patronizing. And so we decided that we really had to just come out and say, we're building this exhibit with a specific perspective. But again, we want to talk to our visitors because I don't know if everyone would agree with me on this, but in my line of work, I really believe that if the visitors walk in, it's a leisure time activity. They choose to be there. And if they walk in and you say, mass incarceration is a natural outgrowth of the structural racism that, whose roots are in the American tradition, That is a non-starter for our visitors. That conversation is not going to, you're not going to get to the end of that sentence, and then you're done. So we really wanted to find a way to meet our visitors where they were in this environment and have some kind of a substantial conversation with them about this. And so even right down to our statement about mass incarceration, we tested it with them to say, does this sound, can we support this? And so we came up with mass incarceration isn't working. And we defined it pretty narrowly. We show the number of people in prison in 1970, again, the number of people in 2015. This is per capita, has nothing to do with population growth. About 3.5 times more people in prison today than there were in 1970 per capita. The rate of violent crime is within 1 percentage point of where it was in 1970. And so we just say simply, as a fact, mass incarceration isn't working. That all the promises of these policies have not borne fruit. And so we need to find another way. The exhibit is built around, what do we do next? What's plan C? Actually, in America, it's really like plan K right now. But all of this process, though, there became a very disturbing aspect. And again, this is really awkward to talk about, but our staff to this day is actually mostly white. I'm also a little bit self-conscious being one of 3 white guys up here talking at you this morning, but there's our staff, especially at the time, was mostly white. And our board, we've made a lot of progress in bringing more types of voices into our organization, but there still felt like there was this aspect of telling someone else's story, of saying, this group over here went through this experience and here's what the impact on those communities. And our director of education, Lauren Zallett, actually it started because I said, as long as we're doing this work, we should be hiring people who've been in prison just into our bookstore. We have all these seasonal jobs. You hire like 40 seasonal positions every summer. So it seemed like we had all these advisors for the exhibit. So I said, let's hire someone who's been incarcerated just into our bookstore. And lo and behold, he began talking to visitors about being incarcerated. And it was unlike I've been in my job for a long time, more than 20 years. And I'd never heard conversations like that on our property. Because the shift from third person to first is unbelievable. I mean, you know this, we all know this, but to actually hear it was just shocking. And so Lauren, experiencing that, said we should be prototyping a more formal policy of hiring people not into the bookstore, but into the tour staff who can talk in first person about what it's like to go to prison. And the ethics behind this are extremely complicated, and I'm not always entirely sure that we have every aspect of it right. But we have begun hiring people who've been incarcerated to talk directly to our visitors about what that's like. And so we're hiring right now our 3rd cohort. This is Craig giving a tour of our chaplain's office, and he would say, this man who was incarcerated here in the 1950s, his name was Lester Smith, painted these beautiful murals, and halfway through this 10-minute tour, he'd say, by the way, I also learned how to paint when I was in prison, and pull out some of the paintings he did while he was incarcerated. This is Josette talking. She's in our synagogue here, but she's talking about her conversion to Islam while she was incarcerated and the role of religion, why it was so important to her, and why it had this lifelong impact on her religious belief being incarcerated. And Marvin talking about, the guides choose what part of the building they want to talk about, and Marvin chose the solitary confinement punishment cells because he had spent some time in one in federal prison. This is a heavy ask for this staff to go out and talk to our visitors. I told you who our visitors are. They're mostly white people on vacation. To go out there and say, hey, I've been in prison. There's a ton of stigma around incarceration in this country. That said, we worry a lot about whether we're being, it's a fair ask for these tour guides, although I've sat in only exit interviews with all of them. They've all said so far they've had a great experience doing this, but it's a lot to ask of this group of people. I know that our visitors have extraordinary experiences talking to these guides. We were concerned that if we began asking these more difficult questions and telling a more complicated story, that it would suppress interest in the building, but our attendance is thriving. We're growing really, really quickly, and I believe that so many of my personal concerns and also our organization concerns, but I was the one, as much as anybody, saying that this could divide our board of directors, this could alienate potential funders, this could alienate visitors, was wrong on every front. Our board has united around this subject matter, so much so that, this is our attendance, by the way, you can read it for yourself. It's grown 4 times in the last 10 years. We started in earnest around 2012, really rolling out this kind of new programming. Our board has united around this. We rewrote our mission statement about a year ago to explicitly talk about criminal justice reform from the nation's founding through to today. So it is now baked into what we say we do at the very DNA level of the organization. And finally, our current project, I was telling Seth about this before we started this morning, our current project is to commission animated films by artists who are currently incarcerated. We're going to project those on the front wall of Eastern State in 2019. We're in the relatively early phases of this. We're putting together our team right now, and we'll be working in prisons for the next year to animate these films. And this is an artist rendering, but this is what we hope it will look like in 2019. Thank you for your time.